Hey guys, Nick Espinoza, your chief security fanatic here. And today I want to talk about the algorithms that either grant your freedom or can possibly take it away. Now, this is coming from a New York Times article that I found absolutely fascinating. And it starts with basically an algorithm that was created by a professor at the University of Pennsylvania in Philadelphia. And it has helped dictate the experience of people on probation for the last 5 years in that state. Now, this algorithm is one of many that is making decisions about people's lives in terms of basically who they are according to the algorithm while they're on probation. Are they high risk? Are they low risk? Or somewhere in between? But this obviously extends way beyond the judicial system. Local authorities are using predictive algorithms to do things like set where the police actually patrol in greater concentration. They help to dictate and determine prison sentences, and obviously also probation as well. And it's not just the United States. This is actually happening around the globe, as well as Europe, who is really adopting this as well. In the Netherlands, for example, they have an algorithm that is supposed to flag welfare fraud risks. In other words, if you are applying for welfare in the Netherlands, they are going to run you through this to see if you are actually potentially defrauding that government. Basically, in a city in Britain rates teenagers who are most likely to become criminals with the goal of actually giving them help before they do this. I've also heard of that algorithm being used in Canada as well. And nearly every state here in the United States has turned to this kind of algorithm, these governance algorithms, and this is according to the Electronic Privacy Information Center, which is a digital rights nonprofit. Algorithm Watch, which is a watchdog in Berlin, Germany, has identified similar programs in at least 16 different European countries, similar to what almost all 50 states here are doing. Now, these algorithms are supposed to be reducing burden on understaffed agencies, cut government costs because obviously you need less manpower if you've got a computer making a decision, and ideally remove human bias. But that's where this gets tricky. We see a lot of privacy advocates, civil rights organizations, and even labor unions are pushing back on this. Now, the opponents here are saying that the government hasn't actually shown much interest in what it means to take a human out of decision making, and I think this is actually a very important point. It's often not clear how these systems are making their decisions. So, is gender a factor? Is age? Maybe zip code? And it's very difficult to actually get clear answers on this because many states and countries have very little rules that actually require the creators of these algorithms to disclose how they're actually building their formulas, their potential ingrained and inherent bias. Now, there's also the bias of the developer itself. So their stances or views, let's say conscious or subconscious, on race, class, geography, can obviously influence development of an artificial intelligence or an algorithm. And we've actually seen examples of this. I've actually done podcasts and videos on this kind of stuff, and I think I've even talked about it on my radio show. But facial recognition bias, studies by MIT show that it basically starts to fail at up to 35% rate when facial recognition is used with women and minorities, and that's because a lot of them are actually written by white males. It's not that they intend to have that failure rate, it's how they're training the artificial intelligence to identify one thing or the other. We've also seen hiring bias at Amazon, where they had created an artificial intelligence to rip through resumes, and they found out that they were actually lowering scores of women when the women were putting on their resumes something like, oh, I belong to like the Women's Society of something, and that was lowering their score. Amazon eventually came out and said that they had not actually used that artificial intelligence in their hiring practice, but here we are. So this is what we're talking about here, and it gets even worse in the sense that the United Nations just came out with a report that warned that governments risked, and I quote, stumbling zombie-like into a digital welfare dystopia. Now, that's the thing. And I think as we start to develop these things and these get adopted, we tend to move, especially with technological evolution, at breakneck speed. And what ends up happening is we break things. We have inherent biases we don't realize or we have to correct once these things become determined. And there has been some positive side on the transparency front, though, because some governments, whether they're local or federal, are starting to realize this possible issue. And interestingly enough, the state of Idaho last year actually passed a law specifying that the methods and data used in algorithms that set bail, in other words, if you are going to get out of jail on bail, those must be publicly available so the general public can understand how they work. In the Netherlands, for example, they're starting to recognize this as well. A district court ruled about a week or so ago that the country's welfare fraud software actually violated European human rights laws. And this is actually one of the first rulings against a government's use of predictive algorithms. So this may set a precedent for how other governments and judicial systems around Europe and the world basically start to adhere to this. And so that's the thing. We have cases here, and in the case of the New York Times, they had an individual named Darnell Gates who had been in prison and then got onto probation, and the computer or the algorithm had classified him as high risk, and by virtue of that, he had to jump through a lot more hoops than somebody that would be low risk, meaning he has to check in with his probation officer every week, he has to do a whole bunch of different things, and obviously as he starts to hit those markers, it loosens up so that the frequency increases and all of that. But if he walked out, let's say low risk, then he would have that, let's say, less frequency, he'd have more flexibility in his life. And how does an artificial intelligence, and this is really the core of the problem, how does an artificial intelligence really know what's in your heart? I mean, I think some things are predictive in the sense that if you're in and out of the penal system, for example, like every other week, you get out of jail, you rob a bank. You get out of jail, you rob another bank. You get out of jail, and on and on and on. You start to see a pattern there. But what if this is a first offense and it is classifying you set on a certain amount of criteria that we don't understand? Maybe you get points off for being a male because the artificial intelligence thinks they'll be more aggressive, or maybe it's a woman, or maybe you come from a zip code that is considered less desirable. How do you calculate these things? Where is that transparency, and how can we say that a judicial system, at least in the case of things that have to do with the judicial system, is a fair and balanced judicial system when we remove that human element? Artificial intelligence really can't read emotion well. It can't see what's in your heart or your motivation, good or bad. And that's a very hard thing to score. And other factors may contribute to who you are, how you were raised, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. But that's a very hard thing to quantify, oftentimes even for humans, and judges and juries have been known to make mistakes due to the human element. And when we're trying to remove the human element, we also lose something else on the other side. So I think it's a very interesting question that we need to ask, and it's a very interesting discussion we need to have, because as we move forward in the future, we want to honestly have the most fair and unbiased system that we possibly can, whether it's adjudicating a parking ticket or something a heck of a lot worse. So I leave it up to you to start the conversation. I'd love to hear from you on this. And that is your news/discussion of the day. And please like, share, follow me here on Facebook and Twitter at NickAESP. And please feel free to subscribe to me at YouTube here as well. And as always, stay safe and stay online. Thanks, guys.